Blackwater Ben by William Durbin, Chapter 32, The Promise of Town. For the next few weeks, camp life would wound down quickly. Once the Blackwater Company had completed its contract, Ben was amazed at how fast the logging operations shut down. The Jacks left in the same order they had been hired. The first men to go were the Sars and the Skidmen, followed by the Loaders and the Teamsters, and Road Monkeys. One by one, the fellows tied their turkeys together and stopped by the clerk shack to collect their pay slips. The last to go were the blacksmith and the wood butcher, who were busy with end-of-the-season repairs. On the day Packy left, he took Nevers aside. "You know all that French cussing I abused you with?" Nevers tensed up like he was getting ready for Packy to broadside him with another French oath. "Well, I wasn't swearing at all." "I don't believe you." "Do you call 'don't count your chickens before they're hatched' cussing?" "What?" That's how en Avril ne te devour pas un fil translates. Are you kidding me? Jiggers punched Nevers in the arm. "Old Pack sure had you going, didn't he?" "But what about those other things you were saying, like tout que quibril nest passor?" Nevers added. "That means all that glitters is not gold. Just like mux tard que jamais is the same as saying better late than never. And vivre et laisser vivre only means live and let live. But my favorite is Al faut severe terre partie du pure. If you are dealt a lemon, make lemonade." "But you made them all sound like cuss words. You heard what you wanted to." Packy extended his hand to Nevers. "No hard feelings?" "No hard feelings," Nevers said, shaking his hand. Packy and Jiggers climbed into the tote teamster's wagon and slipped their turkeys off their shoulders. Then, just as the horses started forward, Packy grinned slyly and called to Nevers. "Tout va bien que finit bien." Nevers threw down his cap and swore. The day after Packy and Jiggers had left, the camp got strangely quiet. Ben was surprised when Pa said, "I sort of miss that little Frenchman." "You do?" Ben said. He and his partner might have been nosy, but they were good company and steady woodsmen. As lousy as the weather was this year, they did a fine job of getting timber out. The day after the Teamsters and the Loaders left, Wendy stopped by the cook shack in the middle of the morning. "Well, Benny boy," he said, "it's time for me to get that new set of choppers. Who's going to take care of the bunkhouse? The handful of fellows who are left can sweep up on their own. The push told me that the dentist in Duluth is so good that you can't tell the difference between teeth he makes up and the good Lord's." "Good luck," Ben said. "I'll be back with my new choppers in a few days. You just be ready to fire me up a big juicy steak. I'll be waiting." Soon the only men left in camp, other than the cook shack crew, were the push, the clerk, the wood butcher, and the dentist. With the lighter workload, everyone was a lot more relaxed. When Ben stopped by the clerk's office to buy a pocket knife, the pencil pusher actually smiled. "So you're going to treat yourself to a present after your long winter of hard work?" "I lost my old one," Ben said. "Those knives have a way of walking off," Wally said, as he marked it down. Ben's purchase in the ledger. "Looks like you haven't wasted much cash. According to my book, you'll have a good steak coming." Ben was surprised when the pencil pusher leaned on the counter and asked, "You figure on signing up for our river drive next month?" "Really?" Ben had been hinting all winter that he'd like to be hired as a log driver, but Wally hadn't said a word. "You suppose Nevers could go too? We could always use a couple of river rats to help us with ride those logs downstream. Don't you go hiring away my cookie as a log driver." Ben turned. Pa was standing in the doorway. Now that Ben Ward had finally learned his way around the kitchen, I don't want nobody drowning him. Pa was complimenting him? "Blackwater Ben," somebody shouted. Ben looked out the door, but all he could see was the tote teamster driving toward the cook shack. And then a face peered over the back of the wagon seat. "Benny boy, how's our swing dingle driver doing?" It was Wendy. Ben and Nevers helped the bull cook climb out of the wagon and limp up the steps of the bunkhouse. Wendy was toothless and bootless and looked like he had been dragged a mile through the mud. "What about your big plans?" Ben asked Wendy as he sat down on the deacon's bench. "Not so many questions, Benny boy." Wendy raised one hand like he was trying to push back the memory of the last 3 days. "When I got to Blackwater, I went straight to the depot like I promised myself. But I met an old buddy named Scott Hull. He offered me a whiskey, and I couldn't refuse. I told him I'd have just one." Wendy hung his head. "The next thing I knew, I'd blowed my whole steak. Tooth money and all." "But what happened to your boots?" Nevers asked. "Boots?" Wendy looked down at his mud-crusted socks. "Danged if I know." Ben was still shaking his head when he and Nevers got back to the cook shack. "How could Wendy waste a whole year's salary in one weekend?" Ben asked Pa. "I warned you." it would turn out this way. But he had such great hopes. It's not like he planned for it to happen. These Jacks live for the moment. They never stop to think about next week or next year. I'm sure Wendy meant to take only one drink. But why can't he change? Don't forget there's a good side of these fellows too, Pa said. Most men go through life pinching pennies and paying on mortgages that they have no hope to finish paying off. But these Jacks don't owe nobody nothing. They go where they want, when they want to. Their lives are their own, free and clear. Ben still couldn't help shaking his head. So you figure on helping me with the Wanigan when the spring drive starts? Pa asked. Ben looked at Pa and Nevers. Me and Nevers are thinking of signing on as log drivers. That's right, Mr. Ward, Nevers said, beaming. As light as I am, I figure I should be able to ride a log down a whitewater rapid and not even get my bootlaces wet. You boys won't want to be out on freezing river when you could be staying dry inside the Wanigan with me. Pa turned back to his work. We're set on trying it, Pa, Ben said. What's that? Pa looked up. Ben took a deep breath. After cooking all winter, Never and I have decided we're ready for a change. Running the river is what we aim to do. For a moment, Pa looked like he was ready to chew Ben out. Nevers took a nervous step backwards, but Ben looked Pa straight in the eye. You're serious, ain't you, Pa said. Ben nodded. Well then, Pa shifted his gaze from Ben to Nevers. I reckon we'll have to be fitting you boys for some caulk boots. On April 1st, Ben and Nevers were helping Pa pack up the last of the kitchen utensils. We better get out of here before the rain starts, Pa said. Once mud time comes, our wagon will be stuck till next month. So where are you staying between now and the river drive? Ben asked Nevers. I figure I'll rent me a place in town. You suppose Mrs. Wilson would have a room? Ben looked at Pa. She usually is full up in the spring, Pa said, but you'd be welcome to bunk with us. Really? Nevers said. Ben grinned. Us cookies got to stick together, don't we? Later that morning, Ben was carrying some supplies out of the root cellar when he heard music. There had been lots of birds twittering in the brush lately, but this didn't sound of a bird song. Ben walked toward the cook shack and stopped. Someone was singing in a deep baritone voice. Just then, Wendy ran from the bunkhouse. He's boiling up, Wendy shouted. I swear he's boiling up. What's going on? Pa stepped outside. It's the dentist. Wendy paused to catch his breath. He's gone to the boiling up shack and he's cleaning himself up. Nevers came to the door, too. I'll be jiggered, Pa looked over Nevers' head. Charlie was strolling toward the cook shack. He was freshly shaven. He was wearing black pants and a white shirt. He carried a towel over his arm. Top of the morning, Charlie said when he reached the cook shack steps. It took Pa a moment to find his voice, but he finally said, Morning. Nevers' eyes bugged out. You got a chin. Everyone laughed as Charlie touched his cheeks and said, Did you think my whiskers were hanging on air? So whatever brought you out of your shack? Pa asked. Young Benjamin convinced me that I had been misinterpreting the end of a famous piece of literature. Pa gave Ben a long look. If Ben has a knack for figuring out stories, he got it from his mother. That may very well be true. Charlie rested his foot on the step and looked at Pa. I've been meaning to have a talk with you and the squire. Your cooking got me through the winter, and I know it's a bit early for tea time, but would you chaps have a cup of swamp water handy? Tea time, Pa frowned. That's a Newcastle upon Tyne talk, Ben said. Squire Benjamin is correct, Charlie said. And is there any chance that you gentlemen might have scones on the menu for this afternoon? We're fresh out of scones, Ben said, but we may be able to scrounge up a piece of lemon pie. That happens to be one of my favorites, Charlie said, putting his arm around Ben and walking through the door. Mine too, Ben said. I'll fetch some cups, Nevers said. You fellers have yourselves a seat. Thanks, son, Charlie said, choosing a bench near the open door. That sun sure does feel good, Pa said. The longer the winter, the more we appreciate the spring, Charlie said. He paused for a moment, then he looked at Ben. Has young Benjamin told you that we have a mutual acquaintance? Pa shook his head as Nevers set a cup of tea in front of everyone. Charlie knew Mother, Pa, Ben said. What's that? Pa frowned as he took a sip of tea. Charlie courted her before you did. Pa stared at Ben, still frowning. I tried to tell you, Pa, but you wouldn't never listen. Pa turned to Charlie and his eyebrows rose. Of course, he said. You must have been that musical Englishman everyone was talking about when I first moved to town. The boys told me about a fancy-dressed fellow who had been hanging around Lucy. That would be me, Charlie said. It sure is a small world. Pa shook his head. I heard you got so mad one day that you stripped off all your clothes and threw them in the river. People do exaggerate, Charlie chuckled. The only garment I discarded was my coat. After a moment of silence, Ben said, Well, you can't say Charlie didn't have good taste in women, huh, Pa? Pa blinked and then smiled. No, I can't. He turned to Charlie. This calls for a toast. Pa raised his teacup, and so did Charlie. Most certainly, Charlie said. He looked at the boys. Will you join us, chaps? Ben and Nevers nodded, and everyone leaned forward so they could clink their cups together. To Lucy Ward, said Pa, and the boys echoed him. To Lucinda, Charlie said. They were quiet for a moment again. Then Charlie smiled and asked Pa, Did you ever hear about the time I hired a fiddler to play outside Lucy's school window? Pa shook his head. It was September, and the students were still restless from their summer holiday, so I... Just then the tote teamster poked his head in the door and called to Charlie. You comin'? Blimey, is it that time already? Yep. Charlie shook Nevers and Pa's hands and then turned to Ben. You behave yourself, Squire, and if you ever decide to swamp your swing dingle driving for inside work, I'd be happy to show you the tricks of the filer's trade. My heart is in teamstering right now, Ben squeezed Charlie's hand, but I can see where it would be nice to stay close to the stove when it's 50 below. Then Pa said, We'll have to continue our visit sometime, Charlie. I imagine that Ben would like hearing more about his ma. Ben and Nevers stared at Pa in disbelief. I've got some stories of my own to tell, along with a few silver mining tales. I'm sure that we can put our heads together and dredge up a few memories, Charlie said. In the meantime, I plan to call a certain widow lady who has a reputation for appreciating the arts of conversation, Charlie winked at Ben. Later that afternoon, Ben noticed something lying on his bunk. He picked it up and sank down on his blanket. It was Charlie's photograph of Ben's mother. Charlie had carved a birch frame for the photograph and left a note beside it. Greetings, Squire. You deserve to have this picture on your wall more than I do. Besides, it's time for me to be moving on. I'll wager a $5 that when you show this to your pa, he'll be able to think of a lot more stories to tell you. Cheerio, Charles Harrigan. P.S. If things work out with Mrs. You-Know-Who, I may see you soon. If not, you and Nevers stay dry on your river drive.